Britain built council estates with genuine hope. After the war, families moved out of cramped terraces into homes with indoor bathrooms and central heating for the first time. Mothers who had raised children in rooms with no running water suddenly had kitchens with fitted cupboards and windows that faced the sky. Communities lifted into the modern age. It looked like the future. The country believed it was building something permanent and good. I have gone through council records, crime statistics, local news reports, and community testimony to bring you 20 council estates where something went deeply and structurally wrong. Hey, before we get into it, if you love looking back at the good old days of Britain, go check out my mate Albert over at Albert's Old Britain. Trust me, he's bringing back memories you didn't even know you had. Let us begin in southeast London, on the edge of the Thames marshes, with an estate so bleak it was chosen as the setting for A Clockwork Orange. The production designers did not change a thing. Thamesmead was built in the 1960s and 70s by the Greater London Council. Brutalist concrete towers rising out of artificial lakes. Elevated walkways connecting block after block for miles. It was designed as a self-contained modernist town for 60,000 people, but it was built on marshland, and flooding began almost immediately. The concrete absorbed damp and never dried out. Those elevated walkways became wind tunnels every winter. Residents describe a very specific acoustic effect at night. Footsteps echo along the concrete corridors in ways that make a single person sound like three. You are never quite sure who is walking behind you. Even today, parts of Thamesmead feel like a place that time and the city council forgot at exactly the same moment. Plans for regeneration have been announced more than once. Each time the promises come with glossy brochures and timelines that slip further and further into the distance. Heading north to Sheffield, we find Park Hill. When it opened in 1961, Park Hill was celebrated as one of the most ambitious social housing projects in all of Europe. The architects Ivor Smith and Jack Lynn designed what they called streets in the sky. Wide deck access corridors where a milk float could drive right to every front door. Families had views stretching across the entire city. Then, Sheffield's steel industry collapsed in the 1980s. The city lost its biggest employer virtually overnight. As money ran out, pubs on the estate were boarded up, and those labyrinthine corridors became passages where nobody walked alone after dark. Locals gave Park Hill a new name. They called it San Quentin, after the California prison. Today, half the estate has been converted into luxury apartments by Urban Splash. The other half stands as derelict concrete with empty window frames staring across the valley. You can stand on one deck and see wine bars to your left and boarded up windows to your right. That single view tells you everything about modern Britain in one glance. In Manchester, the Hulme crescents pushed ambition further still. 4 enormous crescent-shaped deck access blocks, inspired by the Royal Crescent in Bath, only built in poured concrete rather than Georgian stone. At the time, it was the largest public housing development in Europe. The problems appeared within years. Vermin infestations, damp that never dried, asbestos packed into the walls. The heating system had been connected in reverse so that radiators ran full blast in summer and failed entirely in winter. Residents would open windows in August to cool their flats and pile blankets on in December because nothing came through the pipes. The council lacked the funds to demolish what they had built, so they simply walked away and left tenants to fend for themselves. What grew in that abandonment was unexpected. Squatters moved in. Punks and artists and musicians with ties to factory records colonised the empty flats. The place became known as Planet Hulme, a strange creative ecosystem thriving inside structural failure. The crescents were demolished in 1993. Nothing remains above ground. But people who lived through Planet Hulme still talk about it with a complicated mixture of horror and affection. South of the river in London, the Aylesbury estate in Walworth housed roughly 10,000 residents across 2,700 dwellings. 18 kilometres of internal walkways connected the blocks. You could traverse the entire estate without touching the ground. That design feature was supposed to build community. Instead, it created blind spots and cover at every turning. By the 1980s, the Aylesbury was notorious across the country. In 1997, Tony Blair chose to stand on this estate to deliver his very first speech as Prime Minister. He wanted to show that government would care for the poorest. The estate is now being demolished in phases. What is replacing those council homes is largely private housing. The people who lived there for generations are being scattered across boroughs they cannot afford. The waiting lists for social housing in Southwark alone stretch into decades. Families who grew up on the Aylesbury now sleep in temporary accommodation in towns they have never heard of. Their children attend new schools every few months. Their doctors change with every move. The safety net is not a net. It is a conveyor belt that carries people further and further from the places they called home. Broadwater Farm in Tottenham was built in the late 1960s. A high-density complex of towers and connecting walkways in North London. By the 1980s, it had become a potent symbol of urban neglect. Pest-infested stairwells, shadowy corridors where the lights had stopped working years before. On the 6th of October 1985, the estate erupted. PC Keith Blakelock was killed during disorder that followed the death of Cynthia Jarrett during a police search of her home nearby. 3 men were convicted and later acquitted after the evidence was found to be unreliable. Broadwater Farm remains occupied today. It has a fierce community identity. People live there and have done for decades. But the weight of that October night in 1985 still presses down on every walkway and stairwell. Mention the name Broadwater Farm anywhere in London, and people who were not born when it happened still know exactly what you mean. Now we shift from architecture to what happened behind the doors. In Edinburgh, the estate of Muirhouse sits on the northern edge of the city. During the 1980s, heroin tore through the community with devastating force. 51% of the local population tested positive for HIV, more than half the people living there. Needles in the stairwells, needles in the grass where children played. The author Irvine Welsh lived in Muirhouse and drew directly from what he witnessed. Trainspotting is Muirhouse fiction built on Muirhouse fact. The tower block Martello Court earned the name Terror Tower and kept it for 2 full decades. Muirhouse is being regenerated now. New buildings are going up where the old towers stood. But memory does not get demolished along with concrete. The children who watched their parents disappear into addiction are now adults raising their own families. Some stayed. Some could not bring themselves to leave. West to Glasgow, Easterhouse was one of 4 massive peripheral estates. Built in the 1950s on farmland east of the city centre. Families were moved out of inner city slums and placed into a landscape with almost nothing waiting for them. No pubs, no cinemas. one shopping parade to serve a population that reached 50,000. Gang culture took hold by the 1960s and never released its grip. Territorial boundaries divided the estate into sections that outsiders could not read, but every local child understood by the age of 8. Life expectancy was among the lowest in the United Kingdom for decades running. When the politician Ian Duncan Smith visited in 2002, he described his experience there as the catalyst for welfare reform. Community activists have fought for years to change the story, but deprivation persists, and the distance from the city centre still feels like a judgment on who matters and who does not. The Stonebridge estate in Harlesden, northwest London, was built in the 1960s. By the 90s, it had become one of the most violent postcodes in the capital. Gun crime was not occasional, it was constant and visible. Dealers operated openly on the raised walkways in broad daylight. Some police officers classified the estate as territory they would not enter without significant backup. Multiple fatal shootings through the 90s and early 2000s turned Stonebridge into a name that carried weight across London. The estate has since been partially demolished and rebuilt into something unrecognisable, but speak to older residents who remember those walkways and the memories remain immediate. They remember the exact spots. They remember the exact dates. That kind of memory does not fade just because the buildings have changed shape. Bransholme in Hull is one of the largest council estates in Europe. Built from the late 1960s on the far northern edge of the city, with poor transport connections to anywhere else, Hull has ranked consistently among the most deprived local authorities in England according to successive indices of deprivation. Bransholme concentrates that struggle into a single vast estate of identical houses stretching to the horizon. Residents describe feeling physically cut off from the rest of the city. The bus takes 40 minutes to reach the centre. The isolation was not an accident. It was designed into the layout from the very start. When the wind comes in off the Humber in winter, it crosses flat empty ground with nothing to slow it down. People who live on the outer edges say the cold finds every gap in every window frame. Meadow Well in North Shields is defined by what happened on 2 nights in September 1991. 2 local joyriders were killed during a police chase. The estate erupted, shops were burned, the community centre was destroyed. Buildings smouldered for 2 days. What the violence laid bare was not criminality, but decades of abandonment. No employment, no youth services, no investment of any kind. The authorities had ignored Meadow Well until the only response left was fire. Investment arrived afterwards. It always does, but only after the cameras showed up first. There is a pattern with the estates built on the edges of cities. They were placed away from everything, pushed to the margins quite deliberately. Castlemilk in Glasgow sits on a steep hillside south of the city centre. Another of the big 4 peripheral schemes that reshaped working-class Glasgow. When families arrived, they found no shops, no doctors, no schools ready for their children. Getting out of the estate required bus fare and time that many families did not have. Locals called it the Big Cage, a name that stuck for decades. On rainy days, the hillside paths turned to mud, and mothers carried children on their hips just to reach the nearest bus stop at the bottom of the hill. Wester Hailes, on the western edge of Edinburgh, was designed to house 20,000 people in a self-contained community. But self-containment without investment becomes something different. It becomes entrapment. Young men in the estate were identified in multiple academic studies as being among the most at-risk populations in the city for violent crime and early death. The shopping centre that was supposed to anchor the community fell into disrepair within a decade of opening. Shops closed one after another until the building itself became another symbol of a promise that was never kept. In Leeds, the estate of Gipton has appeared in successive deprivation indices among the worst in the country. Postcode boundaries that appear on no official map are understood by every young person who lives there. Walking through unfamiliar territory between neighbouring estates carries real risk. These are borders enforced by teenagers who have nothing else to defend. Blackbird Leys in Oxford became nationally known in the early 1990s as the joyriding capital of Britain. Stolen cars were raced at speed around the estate roads in front of cheering crowds, while police struggled to intervene. The estate sits barely 2 miles from the university's dreaming spires. Tourists punting along the river have never heard of Blackbird Leys. 2 miles apart, and 2 entirely different countries occupying the same city. Students walk past ancient libraries debating philosophy, while families 2 miles south count the days until the next benefit payment clears. Caia Park in Wrexham is the largest housing estate in North Wales. In June 2003, racial tensions escalated into targeted attacks on the homes of asylum seekers who had been placed on the estate by the authorities. Deprivation scores rank among the worst in Wales. Residents describe a deep and persistent sense of abandonment by every institution that was supposed to be responsible for them. When the violence came, nobody in Caia Park was surprised. The surprise was that anyone outside the estate noticed at all. Now we arrive at places where something was taken and never given back. The Heygate estate at Elephant and Castle in South London contained 1,212 council homes. It was declared broken beyond saving, demolished and replaced by a development called Elephant Park. Luxury apartments, private ownership. Council tenants had been promised the right to return, but the new development contained so little social housing and so much time had passed that the promise collapsed under its own weight. A community scattered across London. Most never came back. The buildings are clean and modern and expensive. The people who used to live there have simply gone. On Merseyside, the Boot Estate in Norris Green, Liverpool, was labelled the worst estate in Europe in 2005. Chronic unemployment had hollowed the community out. Buildings deteriorated faster than anyone could patch them. Families found themselves trapped by negative equity in homes nobody would buy. The stigma of the postcode followed residents into job interviews and loan applications. Living on the Boot Estate was not just difficult, it was a label that stuck. A label written into algorithms and lending software and the assumptions of strangers who never set foot on the estate once. The Pepys estate in Deptford stands beside the Thames in southeast London. On the 18th of January 1981, a fire at a house party on New Cross Road killed 13 young black people. Nobody was ever charged. The grief and fury that followed shaped an entire generation in South London. 20,000 people marched through the city. The estate became synonymous with a community that had been devastated and then met with official silence. Decades later, the memorial still stands. Flowers still appear. The silence from the authorities never broke, but the community never stopped speaking. Southmead in Bristol has carried some of the highest knife crime figures in the southwest for years. Gang tensions between Southmead and neighbouring estates create invisible borders that residents navigate every single day. There is a particular 2-mile stretch from certain bus stops into the estate that locals describe without drama or exaggeration. Nobody walks it after dark. Not residents, not visitors, not police on foot patrol. And then there is Primrose Court in Huyton on Merseyside, where residents describe groups of 10 to 20 people from outside the estate bringing violence into the neighbourhood on a nightly basis, where police have discovered cocaine and stolen goods stashed in the abandoned flats, where large sofas and furniture are dragged into the middle of the road and set on fire to block anyone from getting through. Arson attacks in entrance halls have occasionally trapped residents inside, creating an atmosphere of profound fear and isolation. Residents who want to leave cannot sell their homes. Residents who want to stay cannot sleep through the night. Elderly tenants describe lying in bed, listening to the sound of glass breaking somewhere below them, and deciding whether it is close enough to call someone or far enough away to try to ignore it until morning. What connects every single one of these estates is not crime or poverty alone. It is the feeling of having been placed somewhere, and then forgotten. Designed without care, built without budget, maintained without commitment, and then blamed for the consequences of decisions made by people who never had to live with them. The families on these estates did not choose neglect. It was chosen for them by committees and councils and governments that moved on to the next project and never looked back. These places are real. The people who lived there deserved better than they got. And don't forget, if you want a proper trip down memory lane, my mate Albert over at Albert's Old Britain has got you covered. Go show him some love.